I haven't seen the entire film myself about astronomy and the Star of Bethlehem, but I know Laura told me she'd seen it and a number of others, and it's very, very good. And I have, for a number of years, been related in certain ways with Reasons to Believe, a very good organization started by an astrophysicist who came to know the Lord through reading Genesis. And so if any of you have ever been wondering about that, could that be a real thing? Is it just a figure? I think you'd be it's really exciting to hear some of these latest findings, even very late findings about the universe, things we know that can help us to understand that, wow, this could have really happened. So I encourage a number of you to come. What was the date again? The 14th, I think? It's a Friday evening. I think it's the 14th, yeah, for that presentation. And that'll be in the newsletter also to remind you. So, and all this other, I didn't know there was going to be a YMJA regional. So I'm glad Tom mentioned the ages, because some of you may not know what YMJA is. So do I fit into that age bracket? I'm maybe like a year or two too old or something like that, yeah. Okay. So we are going to talk, have any of you film buffs and have heard of the very old, very classic film called Birth of a Nation? Bill, now I know that you weren't around here when that came out, but that was like the 1920s, I think, wasn't it? Yeah. And some of us are old, but maybe not quite that old. So I'm going to speak this morning about the traumatic birth of the nation of destiny. So one way to understand the origins of the Jewish nation is to see the accounts in Genesis and the first part of Exodus as the conception, gestation, labor, and birth of the nation that is to be the firstborn Son of God. Jeremiah 31:9 says, "With weeping they shall come, and with pleas for mercy I will lead them back." And this is, well, it's kind of a prophetic iteration of the Exodus, but "I will make them walk by brooks of water in a straight path in which they shall not stumble. For I am a father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn." This idea of birth and all the stuff around conception, gestation, and birth is certainly a metaphorical view. But it is profoundly explanatory within an integrated view of the Bible, in which all of God's actions with Israel are both real, in other words, they happened in real history, and prophetic. They anticipate the larger story of God's actions in the world. It seems that the writers of the Gospels inherently understood this as part of their fundamental understanding of their identity as Jews. This is why they could readily understand the life of Yeshua as God's son, the seed of conception and the kiln of gestation. So in this view, the stories of the patriarchs in Genesis, and I include Joseph in there, gives us rich and fertile insight, and fertile wasn't actually a pun intended, but it works, into the miraculous and cultivated nature of the seed that produced such an unusual nation. In the first few chapters, so you get that, so the patriarchs, it always talks about the seed. Abraham's seed comes through Isaac, Isaac's the covenantal seed, and there's so much, and all those births were miraculous in one way or another. So then in the first few chapters of Exodus, foreshadowed in Genesis 15:13, the 12 sons of Jacob, now 12 tribes, have been long enduring the intense pressure of slavery in Egypt. They are tightly confined in this place, yet through the difficult and limiting circumstances, God has caused much growth. How many of you here have been pregnant? I'd like to see only females raise their hand. Thank you. And we kind of get that. It's pretty tightly confined in there. You can kind of feel it here. God has caused much growth within this tiny space. In this kiln, he is forging this family into a nation. If Egypt can be seen as the gestation period of the Jewish people, tightly confined yet growing, then the events of the Exodus in this week's parashah mark the terrible birth pangs leading to Israel's traumatic yet supernatural birth in next week's portion. The labor pains begin in last week's portion, in which Moses continually demands that Pharaoh let my people go. Pharaoh does not heed God's word, as we heard today in what we read, doesn't respect God, or who's this God of the Israelites? So God, knowing that what it will take to accomplish this birth, sends much suffering and pain upon Egypt until it is writhing. Even in chapter 6:1, Exodus 6:1, God says that Pharaoh will eventually expel them or push them out of his land. This week in Parshat Bo, the drama reaches its apex. The first 7 plagues have nearly wiped out the economy of Egypt. The last 3 plagues described in Bo are devastating. The language is stark and terrifying, like what we read about the locusts. In each case, God distinguishes between the Hebrews and the Egyptians, as it says several times, one of those times being in chapter 11, verse 7. And the Israelites are spared, not because of any great deeds of theirs. Here are slaves that they don't really know. They do know who God is because it's been generation to generation passed down to them, but they really don't know what it is to serve God. Neither the plagues of locusts, nor the hideous darkness, nor the death of the firstborn of Egypt touches the area in which the Hebrews are confined. Finally, after the last birth pang, Pharaoh and Egypt literally push them out. The Hebrew word used here for push out is derived from the word for strength. After Pharaoh awakens at night to the great cry in Egypt at the death of the firstborn, he commands Moses, "Get out." And the Egyptians strongly applied force. That's how I'm translating it, that word. Strongly applied force upon the Israelites that they might drive them out in haste. That's chapter 12, 29 to 33, if you're taking notes. This, Israel's birthday, is to be memorialized yearly. There is something much bigger here than release from slavery. Chapter 12 begins to reveal some of the mystery, departing from the main story to express something that belongs to the future. Basically, God tells Moses and Aaron, this is to be your birthday as a nation, that you must celebrate every year at this time. The events of your birth are to be remembered and memorialized in specific ways to remind you always whose you are. Now I want to talk about the death of the firstborn. In chapter 12:1, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you." And it's kind of like the first year of Israel as a nation. It is Aviv, spring, the first month for you. The day that the firstborn of Egypt had to die is the day the firstborn of God is painfully born. But the Jewish nation is not untouched by this death either. It reminds us of Abraham's ordeal in Genesis 22, and in the book of Romans, Paul uses the phrase, God did not spare, twice. First in Romans 8:32 to refer to his own son, Yeshua, and second in Romans 11:21 to refer to his son, the Jewish people. In the first words of this portion, in 10:1-2, God tells Moses one of the reasons for the display of his mighty acts of power. Then the Lord said to Moses, and we read this, "Go in to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart, that I may show these signs of mine among them, that you may tell in the hearing of your son and of your son's sons and of your son's son's sons," and on and on, "how I have dealt harshly with the Egyptians and what signs I have done among them, that you may know that I am the Lord." Israel needs to walk in its priestly calling because it is in them that the nations of the world will find blessing. So that's the first words of this portion. In the last words of this week's portion, Exodus 13:11-16, God ordains that all firstborn of Israel are his own. When the Lord brings you into the land he swore to you and your fathers, you shall set apart to the Lord all that first opens the womb. All the firstborn of your male animals shall be the Lord's, i.e. will be sacrificed on the altar. Every firstborn of man among your sons shall be redeemed. The firstborn son was technically the priest of the family, which means he is completely given over to God. But rather than actually be sacrificed, think Isaac, he is redeemed with a price. He belongs to the Lord, yet he lives. He is the Lord's. Furthermore, 13:16 says that the practice of giving the firstborn of man and beast to the Lord shall be as a mark on your hand for frontlets between your eyes, for by a strong hand, the arm of the Lord brought us out of Egypt. But why must the Egyptians suffer in relation to Israel's chosen status? Well, this is a difficult question because in today's philosophical atmosphere, God appears to be very unfair. And if you're just weighing things, maybe he is unfair, but God has a much bigger picture. And this is a bigger question that we can't really address here in this time and space. Well, we could do it in this space, but not in this time. In the world of the scriptures, the distinction made between Israel and the Egyptians is paradigmatic for the war beneath the surface of things. In its simplest terms, this is a war between those who will humble themselves before the might and authority of God and those who will not. It is through the nation of Israel, whom God will cultivate over centuries and discipline harshly, that God's blessing comes to all the nations. In the end, God also shows mercy upon the Egyptians. In Exodus 9:20, it speaks of those who feared the Lord among the servants of Pharaoh. This week's Haftorah portion further explains the reasons for Egypt's suffering. And in last week's Haftorah portion, and that was Ezekiel 29:13-14, God says, "Yet, after all these things, I will bring back the captives of Egypt." Now, he also says they will never have their former might, but he has mercy on all. But God's boule, remember that Greek word that we talked about a few weeks ago, his divine plan is to conquer evil in order to create a new earth without evil and suffering for all who serve him. But to accomplish this, God uses the harsh realities of this world in all of our lives. And most baffling, he uses us, the often clueless, fear-ridden, and ignorant human creatures God has chosen to love. Amen. All right, we can have the worship team back up here.